Have you ever walked through a place that feels ancient, where the air itself seems to hum with stories untold? Maybe you've stood near old stones or ruins and felt a strange pull, a quiet whisper just beyond hearing. There's something deeply human about that feeling, the sense that history isn't entirely gone, that some traces of the past are waiting just beneath the surface for the right person to notice. That's where our story begins today, with a moment of connection so profound it changes everything. And before we step fully into this tale, we'd love to know, where are you joining us from right now, and what hour has settled over your part of the world? Let us know in the comments below. It's always wonderful to feel how stories can bring us together across time and distance. In the world of stone lore, where history is carved not in books, but in rock and memory, there lived a young apprentice named Alara. She was curious, diligent, and deeply attuned to the silent language of the old markers and monoliths that dotted her land. But one evening, as dusk softened the edges of the standing stones in the elder grove, she noticed something no one else could see, a faint, persistent glow tracing the shape of a rune on the oldest stone there. It pulsed like a heartbeat, almost too quiet to notice, and though others walked past it unaware, to Alara it felt like a summons. Without thinking, she reached out her fingers, brushing against the ancient symbol. In that instant, something dormant woke within her, a thread of forgotten magic, humming with energy and memory, now tied irrevocably to her own life force. That single touch set her on a path filled with urgency and mystery. The rune's light now lives in her palm, a constant, fading reminder that she must uncover its meaning before it disappears forever. But this quest is far from simple. To pursue it, she risks her place among the scholars she respects, and worse, she may have stirred forces that were meant to stay buried. This is a story about courage, curiosity, and the cost of awakening what should perhaps remain asleep. It's about the marks we leave behind, and the ones that leave their mark on us. So settle in, open your imagination, and join us as we follow Elara into a world where memory is power, stone holds secrets, and every choice echoes far beyond what the eye can see. Alara's heart raced as she slipped through the grand arches of the great archives, the scent of old parchment and polished wood filling the air. She moved with a scholar's purpose, her fingers tracing the well-known paths along the shelves, heading straight for the oldest sections on runic theory. That faint, persistent glow on her palm seemed to pulse in time with her quickening steps, a silent, urgent reminder that she carried a mystery that defied everything she'd been taught. But as she reached for the heavy, leather-bound volumes that should have held answers, she found only emptiness. The pages where entries on active runes and luminous sigils should have been were neatly excised, cut away with such precision it felt intentional, not decay, but deliberate erasure. Her hope, so bright moments before, began to dim like the light in her hand. Each empty index, each gap on the shelf, whispered the same unsettling truth. Someone did not want this knowledge found. In that hushed, hallowed space, surrounded by the wisdom of generations, Alara felt more alone than ever. The rune on her skin was not just a curiosity. It was a key to something hidden, something feared. And the absence of records could mean only one thing. This was not a forgotten art, but a forbidden one. Her mind turned to the stories she'd heard in whispers of Master Kalin, a brilliant mind exiled years ago for arguing that runes were not just historical markers, but living, active sources of magic. His theories had been dismissed as dangerous radicalism, his name scrubbed from respectable circles. Yet here she stood, with proof, glowing on her own flesh, that perhaps he hadn't been wrong, only ahead of his time. Seeking him out would mark her, too, as a radical. It could cost her place among the scholars she admired, maybe even her future in stone lore. But as she glanced down at the faint light in her palm, she saw it flicker, ever so slightly. Time was not just short, it was running out. With resolve hardening in her chest, Alara turned to leave, her decision made. She would find Kalin. But as she walked back through the archive's echoing halls, she felt the weight of a gaze upon her. The head archivist, a woman named Lyra, known for her strict adherence to tradition and order, stood at the far end of the corridor, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp and assessing. She did not speak, did not move to stop Elara, yet her silent observation felt like a warning. Had she been watching the whole time? Did she know what Alara was searching for? The air, once filled with the comfort of knowledge, now felt thick with unspoken threats. Alara quickened her step, emerging into the fading daylight with a new understanding. Her quest had already drawn attention from those who might wish to keep the past buried. And as the archive doors closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her every move was being traced. By shadows, by silence, and by the slow, steady dimming of the rune that had chosen her. The journey to find Master Kalin was not marked on any map Alara possessed. It was a path built on rumor and half-remembered tales, leading her far from the ordered stone paths of the archives and into the wild, untamed heart of the countryside. For 2 days she walked, following the faint, persistent pull of the rune on her palm, a sensation that grew stronger the closer she came to a particular secluded valley, shrouded in mist and silence. When she finally descended into that green, quiet place, she found not a hermit's crude hut, but a small, meticulously kept cottage nestled beside a stream. And there he was, Master Kalin, a man whose face was etched with the deep lines of isolation and thought, his eyes holding a weariness that spoke of years spent far from the company of others. He watched her approach with a guarded stillness, and before she could even speak her carefully prepared plea, he shook his head. His voice, though quiet, was firm, carrying the weight of hard-earned caution. He told her to turn back, to forget whatever curiosity had driven her here. Meddling with active runes, he said, was not a path of discovery, but of profound peril, a force that had cost him his community, his reputation, and very nearly his sanity. The consequences reached far beyond one person. They could unravel the delicate tapestry of shared memory that held their world together. But Alara, her own hope, flickering as faintly as the rune on her hand, knew that turning back was no longer an option. With a deep breath, she uncurled her fingers and held out her palm, allowing the fading, ethereal light of the rune to speak for itself. The change in Kalin was immediate and striking. The stern resolve in his eyes fractured, replaced by a mixture of awe and something akin to fear. He leaned closer, his own hand trembling slightly as he hesitated just above her skin, not touching, but feeling the energy that pulsed from the symbol. This was no theoretical debate, no radical hypothesis. It was living proof. The connection was real, and it was already in progress, its light dimming with each passing hour. The urgency of her situation overrode his fear. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the burden of years, he reluctantly agreed to guide her, but his agreement came with a grave warning, one that would define every step they took from that moment forward. He explained that rune channeling is not a transaction of energy, but of self. To activate a rune, to draw upon its power, requires a piece of the channeler's own memory as fuel. It is a slow, silent theft of one's own past. The only way to restore what is lost, he believed, was to find the legendary first stone, the primordial source from which all runic power flowed. It was said that at the first stone, the original carvings held the potential to heal such fractures in memory. Their time, therefore, was measured in more than just days. It was measured in the very moments that made Alara who she was. Their first lesson was a simple one, the activation of a minor rune for light. Kalin guided her through the process, focusing not with her eyes, but with her mind, visualizing the flow of intention into the symbol she had drawn in the dirt. And it worked. A soft, warm light blossomed from the lines, pushing back the gathering dusk. A triumphant smile began to form on Alara's lips, but it froze and then vanished completely. A sudden, chilling void opened in her mind. She reached for the memory of her mother's face, the gentle curve of her smile, the specific shade of her eyes, and found only a blurry, indistinct silhouette where a vivid portrait had once lived. The warmth of the magical light felt cold against the sudden emptiness inside her. The cost was real, and it was terrifying. Was this knowledge worth the very essence of her identity? And as she looked at Kalin's solemn, unreadable expression, a new, more disturbing question took root. Was this the whole truth, or was he, even now, holding something back? As full night settled over the valley, Kalin broke the heavy silence. Their path, he said, led to the Whispering Caves. It was a place where the echoes of the ancients were said to linger, where fragmented histories might be overheard by those who knew how to listen. It was their best chance to find clues to the location of the first stone, but his tone carried no optimism, only a deep and resonant caution. The caves, he warned, do not give up their secrets willingly. They are guarded not by creatures or traps, but by the weight of time itself, a place that defends its mysteries fiercely against those who are unprepared. The path to the Whispering Caves was a slow, winding ascent into the high cliffs, where the air grew thin and the wind carried a chill that spoke of forgotten times. Kalin led the way, his movements sure and silent, while Elara followed, her mind still echoing with the hollow space where her mother's smile used to live. The entrance to the caves was not a grand archway, but a narrow, almost hidden fissure in the rock, like a secret the mountain had reluctantly given up. As they stepped inside, the world outside vanished, replaced by a profound, swallowing darkness and a silence so deep it felt like a presence itself. But it was a silence that did not last. Soon, a low murmur began to weave through the air. Not one voice, but many, overlapping and whispering just at the edge of understanding. These were the phantom echoes the caves were named for, fragments of conversations from centuries past, snippets of history spoken by voices that were no longer there. The walls themselves were a library of stone, covered in ancient runes that seemed to shift in the faint, ethereal light that somehow permeated the deep caverns. Some glowed with a soft, persistent luminescence, while others lay dark and dormant, waiting. Kalin warned Alara not to touch any of them, not to listen too closely to any single voice, for the caves were known to ensnare the unwary, trapping them in loops of someone else's memories. They pressed on, the whispers growing more distinct at times, a shouted warning from a long-lost battle, a tender lullaby from a forgotten tongue, the desperate final words of a scribe whose name was erased by time. Each one was a piece of a puzzle too vast to comprehend, and Alara felt the weight of all those lost stories pressing in on her. Their progress was halted by a solid wall of rock, a dead end that felt wrong, as if the path should clearly continue. Kalin ran his hands over the stone, frustration etching his features. He could find no seam, no mechanism, no way forward. It was Alara who saw it, a single, complex rune carved into the wall at shoulder height, one she recognized from her studies as a symbol of revelation, of bringing hidden things to light. She knew what she had to do. The memory of her mother's faded face was a fresh, aching wound, a stark reminder of the cost, but the rune on her palm pulsed weakly, a constant countdown she could feel in her very bones. There was no other choice. Taking a steadying breath, she focused her will, channeling her intention into the symbol on the wall. A brilliant, pure white light erupted from her fingertips and flooded the rune, which blazed to life. For a moment, the entire cavern was illuminated in stark, shadowless clarity, and with a deep, grinding rumble, a section of the wall slid sideways, revealing a chamber that had been sealed for ages. A wave of disorientation hit her instantly. She stumbled, and Kalin caught her arm. "What is it? What did you lose?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Elara clutched at her head, trying to grasp the new emptiness, and then she knew. She tried to summon the sound of Lyra's laughter, her best friend since childhood, the one who could always find humor in the rainiest of days. She could see Lyra's face, could remember the words of their last conversation, but the sound, the unique, infectious, joyous peal of her laughter, was simply gone. Silenced, erased, a single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, not just for the loss, but for the terrifying, casual cruelty of the magic she was wielding. It did not take grand, important memories. It took the intimate, personal treasures that made a life worth living. Shaking off the grief, she stepped into the newly revealed chamber. The air here was still and ancient, untouched by the whispers outside, and there, carved directly into the floor, was a map. It was not drawn on parchment, but etched into the living rock with stunning precision, depicting a vast, unfamiliar territory. At its center was a dense, intricately detailed forest, and within that, a single, prominent marker, the first stone. Kalin inhaled sharply as he recognized the surrounding area. The Sunken Forest, he whispered, the name itself sounding like a curse. He explained that it was a place shrouded in the darkest of legends, a tangled, sentient wilderness where the very laws of nature were said to be twisted. Those who entered rarely returned, and those who did were never again quite right in the mind. Speaking of shifting paths, whispering trees, and guardians that were more shadow than substance. It was then that his own facade cracked, his shoulders slumped, and the confident master vanished, replaced by a man haunted by a personal failure. He confessed that, in his younger, more arrogant days, he had tried to reach the first stone. He had ventured into the Sunken Forest alone, driven by theory and ambition, but the forest had broken his will. He spoke of a fear so primal, so overwhelming, that it had clawed its way into his very soul. He had fled, abandoning his quest and returning to the world, a defeated man, his theories now tempered by the chilling knowledge of what truly guarded the source of runic power. His admission hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. He would not go back. He could not. This left Alara with an impossible choice. She could turn back with him, abandon her quest, and watch the last of her memories, and the rune's light, fade into nothingness. Or she could go on alone, into a place that had broken a master stone lore, with only a stone map and a fading magic to guide her. Her entire future, the recovery of all she had lost, and all she stood to lose, balanced on this single, terrifying decision. The silence in the hidden chamber was heavier than any they had encountered in the whispering tunnels outside. As they finally made their way back through the caves and emerged, blinking, into the daylight, Alara's mind was racing, weighing courage against terror, hope against despair. It was then that her eyes, adjusting to the sun, caught a mark near the cave's entrance. A small, sharp symbol scratched into the rock. It was not an ancient rune. It was fresh, and it was identical to the strange marking she had seen etched onto a shelf in the great archives. On the day her search began, someone else knew their path. Someone was following them, and they were not far behind. The boundary of the sunken forest was not marked by a fence or a wall, but by a feeling, a sudden, heavy silence that fell over them like a blanket, and a shift in the air that tasted of damp earth and old secrets. One moment they were walking through ordinary, if dense, woodland. The next, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The trees here grew in impossible, twisting spirals, their bark a pale, almost silver gray, and the light filtering through the canopy had a bruised twilight quality, though it was only mid-afternoon. The path they had been following simply vanished behind them, swallowed by undergrowth that seemed to knit itself together as they passed. Ahead, not one but 3 narrow trails appeared, each looking equally worn and plausible. Kalin stopped, his face grim. "It begins," he said quietly. "The forest does not wish to be known. It will try to lose us." Almost immediately, the illusion started. A familiar landmark, a distinctive lightning struck oak would appear ahead, offering a surge of hope, only to dissolve into mist as they approached. The sound of running water, a potential guide, would lead them in circles, always just out of sight. At one point, a clear, sun-dappled meadow opened up before them, a promise of respite, but Alara felt a wrongness in the air, a static hum that set her teeth on edge. She hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, she saw the truth. The meadow was a treacherous bog, its inviting grass a thin veil over deep, murky water. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They couldn't trust their eyes, their ears, or even the ground beneath their feet. Desperation began to claw at Alara. The map from the cave was a fading image in her mind, its details blurring against the forest's relentless deception. Time was their enemy in more ways than one. With every minute, the rune on her palm grew dimmer. She knew what she had to do, and the knowledge filled her with a cold dread. She found a relatively clear patch of soft earth, and with a trembling finger, began to carve the rune for clarity, a symbol of piercing truth and unobstructed vision. Kalin opened his mouth to protest, but it was too late. She focused her will, pushing past the fear, and felt the now familiar surge of energy leave her, flowing into the symbol at her feet. The world sharpened, the colors becoming almost painfully vivid. The twisting paths resolved into one true route, and the whispering illusions fell silent, revealing the real, tangled way forward. The victory was hollow. A fresh, profound emptiness opened within her. She reached for a comfort, a small joy she often clung to in times of stress, the memory of the rich, sweet taste of her grandmother's honey cakes, warm from the oven and dusted with cinnamon. It was a taste woven into her happiest childhood memories, a flavor that felt like love and safety, but it was gone, not forgotten in the way a memory naturally fades, but erased. She could picture the cakes, remember the kitchen, see her grandmother's smiling face, but the taste itself was a void. There was no sweetness, no spice, no warmth, only the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. She had paid for their direction with a piece of her soul, and the cost was becoming unbearable. They had taken only a few steps along the now clear path when the silence broke. Figures emerged from behind the silver trees, not slowly, but all at once, as if they had been part of the shadows themselves. They were clad in dark, hooded robes that obscured their faces, and they moved with a silent, unnerving coordination. There were no shouts, no demands, only a swift, efficient movement toward Alara. Hands reached for her, and in that heart-stopping moment, she understood their intent was not to harm, but to capture. Kalin, however, reacted with a speed that belied his years. Shoving Elara behind him, he threw his own hands up. A complex, jagged rune flashed into existence in the air before him, a symbol of blinding, disruptive light. It wasn't an attack, but a defense, a brilliant, concussive burst of pure energy that slammed into their assailants, not injuring them but stunning their senses, causing them to stagger back with arms thrown over their eyes. "Run," Kalin yelled, his voice raw, and they ran, crashing through the undergrowth, driven by pure adrenaline, but the escape was not clean. A thrown blade, meant to deter, found its mark, slicing deep into Kalin's shoulder. He grunted in pain, but didn't stop, his pace only faltering once they had put a significant distance between themselves and the silent figures. Finally, staggering into a small, concealed hollow between the roots of a giant tree, he collapsed against the moss, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale. The makeshift bandage Alara tore from her cloak was quickly soaked with dark, seeping red. As she worked to stem the bleeding, her fingers trembling, her mind raced over the attack. The silence, the robes, the precise and non-lethal tactics. And then she remembered the head archivists, knowing gaze in the great archives, the meticulously cut pages, the symbol scratched near the cave. The pieces clicked into a terrifying whole. These were no common bandits or forest guardians. They were preservationists. The name itself was a whisper from the most cautious, driest historical texts, a mythical order dedicated to one principle: that some knowledge is too dangerous to be active, that certain powers must remain forever dormant to protect the whole of reality. They weren't just a philosophical idea, they were real, and they weren't trying to guide her or warn her. They were hunting her. They saw her not as a curious apprentice, but as a catalyst for a catastrophe, a key threatening to unlock a door that must remain sealed. With Kalin now wounded and weakened, the dynamic of their journey shifted irrevocably. The master, the guide, was depending on her. The weight of their mission settled squarely on Alara's shoulders. The clear path she had bought with the taste of honey cakes was already beginning to fray at the edges, the forest's illusions slowly seeping back. She closed her eyes, trying to hold onto the fading image of the stone map, to the location of the first stone, burning like a beacon in her mind's eye. She would have to lead now. She would have to make the choices, interpret the signs, and bear the costs. As she helped Kalin to his feet, supporting his weight, she heard it again. Not the phantom whispers of the caves, but a new sound. A soft, sibilant rustling that seemed to move through the leaves above them. A sound that felt less like the wind and more like a language, suggesting that other, older things walked these woods, and they were now keenly aware of the intruders in their domain. For what felt like an eternity, they pressed onward through the deceptive gloom of the sunken forest, each step a battle against shifting illusions and Alara's own creeping exhaustion. Kalin leaned heavily on her, his breathing shallow and pained, his injury a constant reminder of the silent, relentless pursuit at their backs. Then, without warning, the oppressive tangle of silver trees simply gave way. They stumbled into a vast, circular clearing where the air was still and charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. And there, at the very center, stood the first stone. It was not merely a monolith. It was a testament to a forgotten age, a towering pillar of obsidian black rock, so tall it seemed to scrape the strange twilight sky. Its entire surface was a tapestry of runes, each one carved with impossible precision, and they did not simply glow. They pulsed with a deep, rhythmic light, a slow, powerful heartbeat of raw, primordial magic. The energy radiating from it was palpable, a hum that vibrated in Alara's teeth and bones, both terrifying and awe-inspiring. As if drawn by an invisible cord, Alara took a step forward, then another, leaving Kalin to steady himself against a tree at the clearing's edge. The closer she got, the warmer the palm of her hand became. The fading rune on her skin, which had been little more than a dim ghost for hours, suddenly blazed to life, shining with an intensity that rivaled the monolith itself. It was a key fitting its lock, and in that breathtaking moment of connection, something miraculous happened. The hollow spaces inside her mind, the voids where cherished memories had been stolen, flooded with light. Her mother's face returned, not as a blurry silhouette, but in perfect, loving clarity. She heard Lyra's laughter, that unique, joyful sound, ringing in her ears as clear as day. She could almost taste the honey cakes, the sweetness of the honey, and the warmth of the spice exploding on her tongue. It was all there, every stolen moment, every precious fragment, restored in an overwhelming wave of relief and joy. A surge of pure, unadulterated hope filled her chest. This was it, the source, the answer. Everything she had sacrificed for was within reach, but the moment of triumph was devastatingly short. The hope curdled into ice in her veins as figures emerged from the tree line, not with the frantic energy of pursuit, but with a slow, deliberate, and chilling purpose. They surrounded the clearing, a silent semicircle of hooded preservationists, and at their head stood Archivist Lyra herself. She pushed back her hood, her face not contorted in anger, but etched with a profound and weary resolve. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the sharp, officious tone from the archives, but carried the grave weight of absolute conviction. You feel it, don't you, child? She said, her eyes fixed on Alara. The wholeness, the return, it is a beautiful lie. She gestured not just at Alara, but at the stone, at the world itself. What you call reactivation, we call unraveling. You are not remembering, you are rewriting. To pull a single thread from this tapestry is to loosen them all. Your mother's smile, your friend's laughter. If you anchor them back into your mind from this source, you risk altering that memory for everyone who has ever known her, everyone who has ever heard that laugh. You could change the past itself, and in doing so, fracture the present for all of us. Some knowledge is a burden. Some power must remain sleeping for the good of everyone. Elara stood frozen, caught between the overwhelming joy of her returned memories and the horrifying scope of the Archivist's warning. It was no longer a personal quest. It was a choice between the soul of her own past and the stability of reality for every living person. The selfish desire to be whole again warred with the terrifying responsibility now placed upon her. She looked at the glowing runes on the stone, no longer seeing salvation, but seeing a web of infinite connections, each one a potential catastrophe. As she hesitated, Archivist Lyra gave a solemn nod to her followers. Two of them stepped forward, holding between them a heavy, wrought iron device, a spiked hammerhead fused with dark, rune-carved metal, a tool designed not for carving, but for absolute, irrevocable destruction. They moved toward the base of the first stone. Panic and clarity arrived in the same instant. Destruction was permanent. There had to be another way, a middle path. Her eyes, sharpened by desperation and countless hours of study, scanned the pulsating runes on the monolith, and there, near its base, partly obscured by moss but unmistakable, was a rune she knew. It was a complex, interlocking symbol of stasis, of suspended animation. It was not a common mark. It was a theoretical construct, a scholar's tool for preserving fragile artifacts. It couldn't destroy the power, but it could freeze it, like a river stopped in mid-flow, buying the one thing she desperately needed: time to think, to understand, to find a solution that didn't demand either her soul or the world's stability. But to activate a rune of that size and power, on the very source of all runes, would demand a price far greater than any she had paid before. It would cost a piece of her so fundamental, she couldn't even comprehend what she might lose. Yet as the Preservationists raised their hammer, she knew it was the only choice left. There was no time for debate, no moment to weigh the consequences. As the Preservationists heaved their terrible hammer skyward, Alara dropped to her knees, her fingers scrabbling in the soft earth at the base of the monolith. The complex pattern of the stasis rune burned in her mind's eye, a web of interlocking lines she had only ever seen in theoretical diagrams. She carved it not with precision, but with frantic, desperate speed, the soil gathering under her nails. She could feel the immense energy of the first stone thrumming through the ground, a power so vast it felt like trying to hold back the ocean with her bare hands. She poured every ounce of her will, her fear, her hope into that crude etching in the dirt, channeling not just her energy, but her very essence into the symbol. The cost would be unimaginable. She knew that in her soul, but the alternative was an unthinkable, permanent end. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the world erupted in a silent, brilliant wave of light. It burst from her makeshift rune, not as a beam, but as a shimmering, crystalline lattice that shot upward, encasing the entire first stone in a barrier that looked like frozen lightning. The pulsating glow of the ancient runes within dimmed, their rhythmic heartbeats slowing, then stilling, locked in a perfect, unmoving moment. The hammer in the Preservationist's hands struck the barrier with a sound that was not a clang, but a deep, resonant chime that shook the very air, and the tool rebounded harmlessly, leaving the stone utterly untouched. A profound, deafening silence fell over the clearing. It had worked. The surge of relief was instantly washed away by a wave of disorientation, so violent it stole the breath from her lungs. Elara collapsed backward onto the grass, her head spinning, the world tilting and blurring around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to anchor herself. She could remember the stone. She could remember the Archivist. She could remember the feel of the earth beneath her hands. But when she turned her head and saw the man with the wounded shoulder struggling to sit up, concern etched on his pale face, her mind offered up only a yawning, terrifying emptiness. She knew him. She knew his face was important, that his presence was a comfort, that he was her, the word, the connection, the very identity of the person who had guided her through this impossible journey was simply gone. A blank space existed where his name should be, and the familiarity of his face only made the void more horrifying. She was alone in a way she had never been alone before, vulnerable and anchorless. Archivist Lyra lowered her hood, her expression not one of defeat, but of grim resignation. She looked at the shimmering barrier, then at Alara, who was shivering on the ground. A stay of execution, the Archivist said, her voice carrying across the clearing without malice. But stasis is not dissolution. The runes are dormant, not destroyed. This shell you have built will crack. It will not hold forever. Her gaze was heavy with a meaning that went beyond warning. It was a challenge. The responsibility was now Alara's alone. She must find a way to safely harness what she had awakened, or find the courage to help them destroy it for good. With a final, unreadable glance, Lyra turned and motioned to her followers. They melted back into the trees as silently as they had arrived, leaving Alara alone with the wounded stranger and the silenced heart of all magic. The man, the one whose name was a hole in her memory, did not leave. Though pain was clear in every line of his body, he crawled closer to her, not with pity, but with a determined kindness. "You do not know me right now," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her whirling panic. "That is the price. I understand, but you must listen. My name is not important. What is important is that you remember why you are here. Look at your hand." She did. The rune there was still visible, though no longer glowing. "You called that forth. You fought to protect this stone not for yourself, but for everyone. That is who you are." He began to speak, slowly, patiently, weaving the story of their journey back together for her. He spoke of the archives of the exile, of the caves and the forest, of the memories lost and the lessons learned. He did not demand that she remember him. He offered her the gift of remembering herself, and in doing so, he demonstrated a loyalty and a redemption that went far beyond any personal connection. He was no longer just a guide. He was a believer in her cause, committed to seeing it through no matter the personal cost to himself. As her disorientation slowly subsided, replaced by a grim understanding of her new reality, a deeper truth began to dawn on Alara. The runes were so much more than a personal key to lost memories. Her own forgotten moments were just the smallest symptom of a vast, incredible power. They were threads woven directly into the tapestry of history itself, To pull on one thread was to tighten or loosen all the others. To rewrite a single memory was to potentially alter the course of events that had sprung from it. This wasn't just about her mother's face or a friend's laughter. It was about battles fought, loves lost, discoveries made, the entire cumulative story of her world, all balanced on the integrity of shared recollection. The weight of it was suffocating, and the temporary solution of the stasis field felt terrifyingly fragile. They needed more than time. They needed wisdom far older than any text or teacher. The answer came to her not as a memory, but as an instinct, a name rising from the depths of that new, profound understanding. The Oracle of Ages. It was a myth, a fireside tale told to frighten and fascinate children, of a being that existed outside of time, that could see the tangled weave of cause and effect spread out like a map. If anyone could understand the true nature of the runes and how they might be balanced without catastrophe, it would be the Oracle. The path would be perilous, the cost likely even greater than anything she had yet paid. But as she looked from the silent, shimmering monolith to the steadfast, nameless man beside her, she knew there was no other choice. The immediate threat was paused, but the real work was only just beginning. The journey to the mist-shrouded peaks was a trial in itself, a vertical climb into a world of howling wind and biting cold that seemed to reject all life. The path was little more than a goat track, often crumbling underfoot, and the air grew so thin that each breath was a conscious, labored effort. Alara, her body still aching from the forest and the immense effort of the stasis rune, felt the cold seep deep into her bones, a numbness that threatened to overwhelm her will. Beside her, Kalin, whose name had slowly, painfully returned to her over the days of travel, though the memory of their shared journey before the stasis spell remained frustratingly fragmented, moved with a grim determination, his injured shoulder clearly paining him in the thin, frigid air. The Oracle was their only hope, a whispered legend pointing toward the highest, most isolated place in the world, and the sheer difficulty of the ascent made it feel less like a destination and more like a test of worthiness. In moments of sheer necessity, when the cold threatened to freeze them in place, or the path vanished entirely into a sheer rock face, Elara was forced to call upon the runes once more. Each time, it was a calculated, heartbreaking transaction. She carved a small symbol for warmth into a flat stone, focusing her will to create a gentle, radiating heat that pushed back the lethal frost. The immediate relief was profound, a blessed wave of comfort, followed instantly by the familiar, sickening lurch of loss. This time, it was the memory of the feeling of sunlight on her skin, not the visual memory of a sunny day, but the actual physical sensation of warmth soaking into her limbs on a lazy afternoon. It was gone, leaving only a clinical awareness of temperature in its place. Later, when a thick, disorienting fog descended, she used a rune for guidance, its light piercing the gloom to reveal handholds and a safe route upward. The cost was the memory of a specific melody her father used to hum while he worked, a tune that had always made her feel safe and loved. The notes evaporated from her mind, leaving behind the knowledge of the song's existence, but none of its comforting sound. These were not grand, sweeping memories, but the small, sensory details that built the texture of a life, and with each one sacrificed, she felt herself becoming a little flatter, a little more hollow, a chronicle of her own existence with entire paragraphs silently erased. When they finally reached the summit, exhausted and gasping, They found not a wise figure waiting in a cave, but a perfectly still, circular pool of water, its surface as smooth and dark as polished obsidian, despite the fierce winds that whipped around the peak. It was nestled in a natural stone basin, utterly untouched by the elements, and the air around it was preternaturally calm and silent. This was the oracle. There was no voice, no guide, no explanation. There was only the water. With a trembling breath, Alara knelt at its edge and gazed into its impossible depths. The dark surface shimmered, then cleared, not showing her reflection, but pulling her into a vision of a time so ancient it felt like the dawn of the world. She saw the first people, not as primitive cavemen, but as beings of profound insight and connection. They witnessed the flow of history, the rise and fall of tribes, the lessons learned through joy and terrible suffering, and they feared these stories would be lost to time. So they devised the runes. Each symbol was not an arbitrary mark, but a perfect, resonant shape designed to capture and hold a specific memory, an event, a truth. They carved them into stone, believing the permanence of rock would preserve the permanence of truth, and for a time it worked. Knowledge was preserved, history was recorded. But they failed to foresee the consequence. The runes did not just record memory, they amplified it, connected it, and began to draw upon the very fabric of time itself. The power contained within them grew exponentially, far beyond what their creators could control or even comprehend. The vision showed her the terrifying moment the ancients realized their mistake, that by creating a perfect record, they had created a weapon capable of rewriting reality itself, of unraveling the past and therefore the present. Faced with this unbearable responsibility and seeing the potential for cataclysm, they made a conscious, agonizing choice. They used their own immense knowledge to bury the runes, to sever the active connection and render them dormant, silent marks on stone. They chose to protect humanity from its own ingenuity by allowing the deepest truths to fade into myth, believing that a forgotten history was a safer fate than a rewritten one. As this revelation washed over her, the vision in the pool shifted. It showed not the past, but a potential future. She saw the runes not carved into cold, dead stone, but inscribed onto the bark of living trees, the petals of resilient flowers, the skin of willing individuals. The image was one of harmony, not control. The living matter did not simply hold the magic. It interacted with it, grew with it, used its own life force to temper and stabilize the runic power. The memory stored in a tree would become part of the tree, its growth a slow, steady release of energy rather than a sudden, catastrophic surge. The rune on a person's hand would be anchored by their own consciousness, their life force acting as a regulator. But the vision was also brutally clear about the cost. This stabilization required a permanent, willing sacrifice. To anchor a rune in a living thing, a piece of one's own memory had to be given up forever, not just channeled and lost temporarily, but consciously offered as a foundational stone for the new balance. It was the difference between renting and owning. The memory would be gone from the giver, but it would exist eternally, safe and stable, within the living vessel. The water's surface stilled, returning to its dark, mirror-like state. The vision was over. The answer had been given. Elara slowly rose to her feet, the weight of the understanding settling upon her not as a burden, but as a dreadful, heartbreaking clarity. The path forward was no longer a mystery. to save others from the loss she had endured, to prevent the unraveling Archivist Lyra feared. She would have to become the anchor. She would have to willingly surrender the most cherished memories she had left, not as an accidental cost of using power, but as a deliberate, permanent offering to stabilize it. Her journey was no longer that of a seeker trying to reclaim what was hers. It was the path of a guardian, ready to sacrifice her own past to protect the future of everyone else's. A profound sorrow settled in her heart for the pieces of herself she would have to leave behind, but beneath that sorrow, a new, steely purpose took root. As they began the careful descent from the silent peak, the wind felt less biting, the path less treacherous. The way forward was clear, and though it led back to the first stone and the waiting Preservationists, she now carried the one thing that had been missing, not just an answer, but a choice, and the resolve to see it through, no matter the personal cost. The journey back to the first stone felt both shorter and infinitely longer than the first time. Every step was weighted with the oracle's revelation, a truth that had settled deep in Alara's bones. When they finally broke through the tree line into the familiar clearing, the sight that greeted them was one of quiet crisis. The beautiful, crystalline stasis barrier she had woven around the monolith was no longer perfect. Hairline fractures of brilliant, white light spider-webbed across its surface, and with each pulse of contained energy from the stone within, the cracks widened slightly, emitting a low, worrying hum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Time, the one thing she had fought so hard to buy, was bleeding away, and they were not alone. From the opposite side of the clearing, Archivist Lyra and her Preservationists emerged, their expressions set with a grim finality. This time, they carried no simple hammer. They brought forth tools of dark, polished metal that gleamed with their own counter runes, devices designed not to stun, but to shatter, to reduce the source of all runes to inert dust. There was no moment for debate, no chance for persuasion. The race was on. Alara met Kalin's eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. He gave a sharp nod, turning to face the advancing order, his hands already moving to carve defensive symbols in the air. Elara did not wait. She dropped to her knees before the nearest tree, a great, ancient oak whose roots seemed to grip the very heart of the earth. Ignoring the shouted commands from Lyra, ignoring the rising cacophony of conflict, as Kalin's first barrier of shimmering force erupted into existence, she focused everything she had on the oracle's teaching. She pressed her fingers against the rough, living bark and began to inscribe the first rune. This was not like carving in dirt or stone. The tree resisted for a fraction of a second, then yielded, its surface accepting the mark as if it had been waiting for it. The energy flow was different, not a sudden, draining pull, but a slow, deliberate exchange. She had to consciously open herself, to offer up a memory as payment, to push it from her mind and into the living wood. The first memory she gave was one of her proudest moments, her first victory as an apprentice. She had correctly identified a set of mislabeled foundation runes on the oldest bridge in the city, preventing a potential collapse. She recalled the swell of pride in her chest, the stunned, then deeply respectful look on her master's face, the way the sunlight had caught the dust motes in the archive as he'd said, "Well done." She felt it all, the emotion, the visual clarity, the sensory detail, and then she let it go. It flowed out of her and into the tree, and the rune on the bark flared with a soft, green-gold light before settling into a steady, gentle glow. The space in her mind where that memory had lived was simply empty. A trophy room now held a blank pedestal. She moved to a cluster of resilient ferns next, her fingers trembling, but her will unwavering. The Preservationists were pushing hard against Kalin's defenses. She could hear the sizzle of conflicting energies, the shouts of frustration, and Kalin's voice, raised not in anger, but in passionate argument. Look at her, she is not destroying, she is healing. She offers a third path. Alara carved the second rune. The price this time was the memory of the warmth of her childhood home, not the building itself, but the feeling of absolute safety and comfort she felt when curled by the hearth, her father reading stories, the scent of stew in the air, the feeling of being utterly, unconditionally loved. It was a foundational warmth that had sustained her through many a cold night. She surrendered it, and a wave of profound coldness washed over her, a chill that had nothing to do with the forest air. The fern glowed, its fronds trembling as they absorbed the memory, weaving it into their very cells. Kalin fought not to harm, but to protect and to persuade. He wove complex patterns of light that created bewildering mazes of illusion, making the Preservationists stumble and lose their way, mere feet from their goal. He erected transparent, resonant shields that rang like giant bells when struck, deflecting their tools but not their persons. And all the while, he spoke, his voice cutting through the din. You are so afraid of the fire that you would let the world freeze. She has found a way to tend the hearth without burning down the house. Look, just look at what she is building. Some of the Preservationists, those less certain, those who had joined out of duty rather than fanaticism, began to falter. They saw Alara, pale and shaking, sacrificing pieces of her very self onto the living things around her. They saw the runes she created not blazing with dangerous power, but humming with a peaceful, ancient harmony. They saw the cracks in the stasis field slow their spread as the new network of living runes began to share the burden of containment. The absolute certainty in their mission began to fracture. Elara continued, a ghost of herself haunting the edge of the clearing, paying a terrible price with each step. She gave the memory of her first friend. She gave the memory of the starry sky from her grandmother's rooftop. She gave the sound of her own name being called with joy. Each loss was a small death, a quiet extinguishing of a light that had once made her her. She was becoming a vessel of collective memory by emptying her own. Finally, with the last of her strength, she inscribed the final rune onto a delicate, bell-shaped flower at the very base of the first stone. The memory she offered was the last fully intact one she had left. The feeling of her mother's hand holding hers on her first day of lessons, a perfect, golden moment of encouragement and love. As she let it flow into the flower, she felt something inside her break, not with pain, but with a final, peaceful release. She collapsed onto the moss, utterly spent, her mind a quiet, echoing hall of closed doors. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft gasp rippled through the clearing. The weakest of the glowing ferns, the oldest of the trees, the most delicate of the flowers, every single thing that bore one of Alara's runes, began to pulse in unison. The light was not the fierce, white pulse of the first stone, but a deep, emerald radiance, the color of life itself. The light traveled through the roots underfoot, through the air, connecting all the runes in a single, shimmering web. This living network reached out to the failing stasis field, and instead of breaking it, embraced it. The frantic, cracking light of the stone softened, its rhythm slowing, deepening, until it beat in time with the gentle pulse of the forest. The terrifying hum faded, replaced by a low, soothing thrum, like the world breathing a long-held sigh of relief. The energy was no longer trapped and threatening to explode. It was channeled, balanced, harmonized. It was part of the world again, not a weapon against it. Archivist Lyra lowered her tool. The anger and fear had drained from her face, replaced by an expression of awe, and then, slowly, a dawning, profound respect. She walked toward Alara's prone form, not with threat, but with reverence. Kalin moved to stand between them, but Lyra shook her head, her gaze fixed on Alara. She knelt. "You did not just save it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You integrated it. You gave it a home." She looked around at the peacefully glowing forest, a living library of memory and power. "We were wrong. We saw only the danger. You saw the symbiosis." She offered a hand not to seize, but to help. "Let us help you. Let us document this. Let us learn, so that this wisdom is never lost again, and never feared." In the days and weeks that followed, the clearing around the first stone became a place of pilgrimage and study, not of secrecy and fear. Elara and Kalin, with the dedicated help of the reformed Preservationists, established a new school there. They built simple structures that respected the forest, and their first lesson was always one of reverence and caution. They taught that rune magic was not a tool for personal gain, but a sacred responsibility, a pact between the user and the memory of the world itself. Elara, though she remembered little of her own life, her childhood was a blur. Her personal triumphs were stories told to her by others. The faces of her family were kind strangers in her mind, found a different, deeper kind of joy. She became a guide for others, helping them inscribe their own precious memories onto living things for safe keeping, or to carefully access the collective knowledge now held stable in the network. She was a living testament to the ultimate cost and the ultimate purpose of the runes. Her personal past was largely gone, but she lived every day surrounded by the preserved past of everyone else, a trade that filled her with a sense of profound peace. The story concludes not with an ending, but with a beginning. Alara stands before a young sapling, a new addition to the ever-growing grove. She traces a simple rune of protection onto one of its tender leaves, a gentle smile on her face. She feels no sense of loss in this action, only a quiet certainty. She understands now that the most important marks are not those carved into unyielding stone, demanding to be remembered unchanged. The truest marks are those given to growing things, where they can live and breathe and evolve, becoming part of the beautiful, endless growth of what is yet to come. The air in the grove hums with a quiet, living energy, a symphony of rustling leaves and soft, emerald light that pulses gently from the bark of the rune trees. Elara stands at its heart, a silent witness to the new world she helped create. Around her, a new generation of students moves with a reverence she once only dreamed of, their fingers carefully tracing symbols of joy and remembrance onto willing saplings. There is no fear in their eyes, no dread of loss, only the focused peace of those entrusted with a sacred duty. They are learning to inscribe memories without paying the terrible price she once did, their lessons built upon the foundation of her sacrifice. She watches them, and though the faces of her own teachers are shadows in her mind, and the memory of her first day as an apprentice, is a closed book. She feels a profound connection to this moment. Her personal past is a landscape of quiet rooms, but her impact is etched into the very light around her, a legacy that will endure long after she is gone. Kalin is often at her side now, no longer a reclusive master, but a trusted colleague, his once weary eyes now alight with a purpose reborn. They have built something extraordinary here, not just a school, but a bridge. The Preservationists, once their hunters, are now their most dedicated partners. Archivist Lyra can frequently be found seated beneath the great oak that holds Alara's first memory, her stern demeanor softened into that of a passionate scholar, meticulously documenting the new symbiosis between rune and life. The air that was once thick with suspicion and fear now carries the sound of collaborative discussion, a united effort to protect history, not by burying it, but by understanding its living breath. The divisions that once defined their world have healed into a single, shared purpose, and Alara, though she cannot recall the specific moments of conflict, feels the rightness of this peace in her bones. There are days when the emptiness within her feels vast, a silent ocean where the landmarks of a life should be. She cannot summon the sound of her mother's voice or the taste of a meal shared with a friend. Yet in their place, she holds the collective stories of countless others. A young student might approach her, their face radiant after successfully anchoring a beloved family story into a flowering vine, and in their joy, Alara finds a reflection of a feeling she once knew. She helps an elder preserve the memory of a long-lost homeland in the resilient heart of a hawthorn tree, and though the specific sights and smells are not her own, she is woven into the tapestry of its preservation. Her solace is not in remembering herself, but in being the vessel through which remembrance is made possible for everyone else. She has become a guardian of balance, a living channel, ensuring that the runes serve to connect and enrich, rather than consume and unravel. As the sun begins to set, painting the grove in hues of gold and violet, Alara walks alone to the edge of the clearing where the youngest saplings are nurtured. She reaches out and places her palm flat against the slender trunk of a silver-leaf tree, one that had been little more than a whip of a plant when she first inscribed the rune of foundation upon it. The bark is smooth and warm beneath her touch, humming with a gentle, steady power. She closes her eyes, not trying to remember, but simply to feel the peaceful rhythm of the grove. And then something shifts. It is not a memory that returns, not a clear image or a distinct sound. It is a sensation, a sudden, unexpected warmth that spreads from the palm of her hand up through her arm, flooding her chest with a feeling of absolute, unconditional safety. It is a feeling she has not felt since she was a very small child, a feeling she had given up forever to the forest. For a single, breathtaking second, it is there, whole and perfect, as if the tree itself is offering it back to her. Then it fades, leaving behind not an emptiness, but a quiet, resonating hope. The magic she saved, the balance she forged, does not just take. In its own mysterious way, it also gives back. It is a gentle hint that in the great weaving of stories and time, nothing is ever truly lost. It is only waiting, transformed, for the right moment to return.